September 1943, over Bougainville, Corsairs carved tracer paths through jungle heat. And miss. Pilots empty belts, Zeros slip the net, and good men don't come back. Command blames aim. Engineers blame nerves. In a sweating maintenance tent, one Marine Ordnance Sergeant studies gun camera film and sees the flaw everyone ignored. The bullets meet too far away. Tonight, he'll break rules, twist steel, and pull convergence in close, turning scatter into a scythe. What follows will change dogfights, save pilots, and rewrite the manual. If you love hidden war engineering and untold heroes, stick around and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. This is how a wrench beat doctrine at 300 feet. Marine fighter squadrons in the Solomon Islands were losing momentum fast. On paper, the F4U Corsair was a monster of a plane. It flew faster, climbed harder, dove like a stone, and carried 6 heavy Browning machine guns, each one able to tear an aircraft apart in seconds. But gun camera footage told a very different story. When pilots returned from missions, the film showed swirling circles of tracer fire dancing around Japanese Zero fighters. Every attack pass looked perfect until you slowed the reel down. Then the truth appeared. The bullets weren't missing wildly at all. They were outlining the enemy, forming a hollow cage of lead, with nothing striking the center. Officers insisted the solution was discipline. Fire shorter bursts, aim better, conserve ammunition. But inside the cockpit, where engines roared and everything blurred past at hundreds of miles per hour, that advice felt useless. Accuracy wasn't the real problem. Something deeper was broken. The place where all those bullet streams were supposed to meet was set far downrange. Factory engineers chose a long convergence distance using calm test conditions. In a clean laboratory, that sounded smart. In a frantic dogfight, it was a disaster. Most kills happened dangerously close, in tight spirals where the enemy flashed across the sight for less than a second. Pilots who hesitated died. Pilots who tried to fight from long range wasted half their ammunition just landing a handful of weak hits. Worse, once those guns went empty, the Zeros returned like wolves. Enemy radio messages even mocked them, saying American bullets spread like rain. Japanese pilots began baiting Corsairs into firing early bursts, then circling behind them once they ran dry. Back on the ground, tired pilots stared at smoked-over gun barrels and empty belts, frustrated and confused. Their instincts said they were doing everything right. The evidence on film said something was fundamentally wrong. And high-ranking officers were too focused on standard procedures to notice the obvious. But far from the briefing rooms and command tents, one quiet ordnance sergeant paid attention. He watched the pattern, studied the angles, and began to suspect that the real enemy wasn't the Zero at all. It was an idea everyone else accepted without question. Staff Sergeant Michael "Mickey" McCarthy didn't look like the kind of man who would change aerial warfare. He wasn't a decorated pilot, he didn't hold a college degree, and he definitely didn't spend his nights in strategy briefings. He was a mechanic, an ordnance specialist, the kind of Marine whose hands were always dark with grease and whose pockets rattled with loose bolts. Born in Boston during the Great Depression, he grew up fixing cars in his father's garage. There, he learned something schools never taught. Machines tell the truth if you know how to listen. When America went to war, McCarthy enlisted for steady pay and food. The Corps assigned him to load ammunition, clean barrels, and repair jammed firing systems. Most Marines saw his job as simple maintenance, but McCarthy saw patterns. After each mission, he helped unload empty belts and sweep up spent casings. He noticed the same thing again and again. Ammo was vanishing faster than kills were being made. Pilots were burning entire belts and coming home angry. They'd talk about perfect aim, perfect positioning, clean lines of fire, but only a handful of rounds ever hit anything important. Between missions, McCarthy stayed to watch gun camera film the way a doctor studies an X-ray. He wasn't looking at pilots. He was looking at bullet spread. He noticed how the streams formed two bright lines that met far ahead of the aircraft, then drifted apart again. In real combat, that point was too distant. When enemy fighters darted around at close range, the bullets passed harmlessly around them. After watching enough footage, the geometry burned itself into his mind. Something strange was happening. The system worked perfectly everywhere except in reality. While officers blamed pilot nerves and engineers hid behind test charts, McCarthy quietly wondered if the guns themselves were aimed for the wrong kind of fight. Every time pilots returned exhausted and frustrated, every time a Zero slipped through a storm of lead untouched, McCarthy's suspicion grew stronger. He measured gun mounts, angles, and spacing when nobody was watching. He scribbled notes on scrap cardboard. He ran numbers in his head, just like aligning headlights in his father's old garage. One night, staring at film reels under dim lantern light, the realization struck him like a bolt. The guns weren't failing because of bad aim. They were failing because the bullet streams were meeting too far away. A tiny change, just a shift in angle, might transform a scattered spray into a focused blade. It sounded insane, and it broke every rule. But rules weren't keeping pilots alive. And McCarthy was done watching good men die over an engineering assumption. He didn't have rank. He didn't have permission. What he had was a wrench, some scrap metal, and the stubborn belief that the manual was wrong. Wing-mounted guns are not aimed straight ahead. Each barrel sits several feet from the center of the aircraft, so engineers angle them inward. The idea is simple. At a certain distance, all bullets cross into the same small space. Hit a target at that exact point, and the enemy aircraft is torn apart in seconds. On a clean whiteboard, that concept is flawless. Factories set the Corsairs' guns to meet far out in front of the aircraft because engineers believed pilots would fire calm, controlled bursts at long range. Test pilots agreed. Training manuals repeated it. And once something becomes standard, nobody questions it. But the Pacific wasn't a whiteboard. Dogfights there were messy. Aircraft twisted and rolled in tight spirals, closing to knife-fighting distances. The enemy flashed across the sight picture, not far out, but almost point-blank. At those distances, the Corsairs' guns were no longer converging. They were spreading back apart. The bullet pattern looked like a giant ring around the cockpit of the enemy plane. Pilots weren't missing because they were bad. They were missing because the geometry of their guns was built for a fantasy. McCarthy rewatched film until the pattern screamed at him. When the Zero was far away, bullets passed in front and behind. When the Zero got close, really close, the bullet streams split wide again, like a V shape widening after the crossing point. It explained everything. Pilots complained that even when the enemy filled the windscreen, their guns somehow felt weak. The truth was chilling. The Corsairs' deadliest zone existed where no real fight ever stayed. Official memos warned that adjusting convergence closer than 500 feet would stress the gun mounts and crack wing panels. Engineers insisted the metal couldn't handle the recoil. Officers repeated those orders, and pilots accepted them because survival demanded obedience. But McCarthy had a mechanic's eyes. He saw extra thickness in the mount housings. He saw available bracing points near the wing spars. He knew, deep down, that the aircraft could survive a steeper angle, if reinforced correctly. And then there was travel time. At long range, bullets took almost a full second to reach their target. In a dogfight, 1 second is eternity. By the time bullets arrived, the Zero had already turned, climbed, or twisted away. But at close range, the bullets struck almost instantly. Less movement, less guesswork, less wasted ammunition. The flaw wasn't the pilots. The flaw wasn't the gun. The flaw was distance. Somebody with courage and a wrench would have to pull that convergence much closer than any manual dared suggest. McCarthy ran the numbers. He folded paper models. He watched more film until dawn. A new picture formed in his mind. All 6 guns crossing at 300 feet, creating not a loose pattern, but a concentrated stream that could rip a fighter in half with a single 1-second burst. It was madness. It was genius. It was against orders. And there was only one way to find out if he was right. McCarthy waited until the flight line went quiet. Engines cooled in the dark. Tools clinked into drawers, and pilots limped back to their tents. Only the ordnance sheds kept their lights burning. He called over 2 trusted crewmen, men who had swept shell casings off the floor after too many funerals, and rolled 1 Corsair into the maintenance hangar. It belonged to Captain James Sweat, the pilot who had watched his wingman vanish into jungle smoke days earlier. The factory settings angled each gun gently inward, meeting far downrange. McCarthy planned something far more aggressive. He stripped damaged wing panels for thick steel, cut reinforcement plates by hand, and welded them to the gun mounts. Sparks flew across the deck, lighting the hangar like lightning inside a cave. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Each strike of the welder echoed like defiance. Then came the adjustments. Using a wooden jig built from scrap boards, McCarthy carefully shifted the guns inward until their bullets would cross at 300 feet. It looked wrong, almost crooked, but on paper and on film, it was perfect. Hours passed. The island's humid air clung to the metal. McCarthy tightened bolts until his knuckles bled, then sighted the barrels against a target frame positioned at the exact distance he had calculated. No manuals, no officers, just angles, instinct, and stubborn belief. At dawn, he test-fired into the ocean. The braces held. No cracks, no bending. The guns thundered like approval. When Captain Sweat walked up later that morning, he froze at the sight of the barrels, angled inward like clenched fists. "What did you do to my guns?" he asked. McCarthy swallowed hard. He knew one wrong sentence could end his career. "I brought the fight closer." If this failed, both men risked court-martial. If it worked, they might live to see tomorrow. The test came sooner than anyone expected. Late that morning, alarms rippled across the airfield as spotters reported a mixed force of Japanese fighters and dive bombers sweeping toward Allied positions. Mechanics scrambled, engines roared awake, and pilots sprinted across the coral runway. Captain James Sweat climbed into his Corsair, the only aircraft on the island with guns angled like clenched fists, and taxied out with 3 wingmen beside him. Nobody except McCarthy understood how different this machine really was. The patrol climbed into thick Pacific haze, sunlight flashing off the ocean far below. As they approached Empress Augusta Bay, the dots on Sweat's canopy glass sharpened into shapes. A dozen Zeros weaving protectively around a formation of bomb-laden Betty bombers. It was the kind of engagement that usually favored the enemy. More guns, more planes, more angles of attack. But Sweat didn't hesitate. He pushed the nose down and accelerated into a steep dive. His wingmen fanned out, trying to gain position. The Japanese pilots reacted instantly, peeling off to block him. At 400 yards, Sweat held his fire. His nerves screamed to open up, but McCarthy's voice echoed in his memory. Closer. At 350, he waited still. Wind howled across his canopy. At just under 300 feet, the Zero filled his sight like a bullseye. No time to think, only muscle memory and faith. He squeezed the trigger for exactly 1 second. The result was horrifying and beautiful. Instead of scattered sparks, a single solid beam of tracers slammed into the Zero's tail. Metal shredded. The fuselage snapped like a twig. Fuel sprayed into flame. Debris spun backward in a cloud so dense, Sweat was forced to brake right to avoid flying into it. His radio crackled with disbelief from the wingmen who witnessed the explosion. He didn't pause. Sweat rolled, lined up on the next Zero, and struck again at the same brutal distance. Another brief burst, and the left wing of the Japanese fighter separated cleanly, flinging loose like a leaf in a storm. A third target tried to jink hard to avoid the deadly stream, but at 280 feet, there was no escape. Sweat tapped the trigger, and the cockpit erupted into shards of glass and smoke. All of this happened in under a minute. While his wingmen chased angles and shouted for openings, Sweat was already tallying victories, each one costing only a handful of rounds. When the last bomber fell flaming into the sea, he pulled away, startled by how quiet his guns still felt. His ammunition counters showed more than half his belt remained. Back at the airfield, tension choked the humid air. Officers, pilots, and ground crew waited by the runway, desperate to see if the modified aircraft limped home or didn't return at all. When Sweat's Corsair rolled to a stop and the canopy popped open, the crowd surged forward. No cracked wings, no broken mounts, no fire damage. Just a wide-eyed pilot who looked like he'd witnessed something impossible. Sweat's voice shook as he climbed down. "I barely touched the trigger," he said. They fell apart. Some stared at the reinforced mounts. Others stared at McCarthy. Rumors spread like fire in tall grass. Pilots whispered about focused death and a wall of bullets. The old arguments about regulations suddenly felt childish. For the first time in weeks, the airfield wasn't full of mourning. It was full of hope. When Sweat's Corsair rolled to a stop, the flight line swarmed like a kicked nest. Pilots pointed at the angled barrels, mechanics traded nervous glances, and everyone talked at once. 5 kills with barely any ammunition spent? Nobody in the squadron had ever seen results like that. The celebration lasted only seconds before senior officers marched toward the hangar, faces tight with anger. They weren't here to congratulate anyone. Major Britt pushed to the front and confronted McCarthy. "What did you change?" The answer was simple. Gun convergence, pulled in to 300 feet. The reaction was explosive. Lieutenants gasped. A captain swore under his breath. And then, Lieutenant Colonel Millington, the officer who issued the memo against close convergence, arrived like a storm cloud. He lectured the hangar floor with every regulation in the book. He warned about cracked mounts, stressed wings, and dangerous recoil forces. McCarthy stood quietly and took the blast. But then Sweat spoke. Calm, steady, and brutally honest. He described watching enemy aircraft come apart in single bursts. He showed how much ammunition he still had left. Around him, pilots nodded, the weight of recent funerals heavy on their shoulders. To them, this wasn't theory. It was survival. Lieutenant Hansen stepped forward. "Sir, request permission to have my guns modified the same way." Denied. Another pilot tried, denied again. The tension snapped. Voices rose. Pilots argued about wasted belts, outnumbered dogfights, and watching friends fall into jungle fire. Millington countered with orders, procedure, and chain of command. The divide was clear. Paper versus proof. Major Britt finally cut through the noise. He turned to McCarthy, not Millington. "Sergeant, can you modify every Corsair in this squadron by morning?" McCarthy didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." Millington erupted, threatening investigations and court-martial charges. Britt didn't flinch. "If it works, we live. If it doesn't, the enemy will handle the punishment." Night fell, and welders lit the hangar like a forge. Mechanics reinforced mounts, adjusted angles, and bore-sighted every barrel. Pilots stood behind them, doing whatever they could, fetching tools, holding lamps, offering coffee. The roar of hammers replaced the quiet despair that had hung there for weeks. By sunrise, every flyable Corsair pointed its guns inward like sharpened claws. The paperwork would come later. For now, the only thing that mattered was the next fight. The squadron had gambled everything on one mechanic's math, and the Pacific sky was about to feel the difference. The very next day, radar operators called out another inbound wave, fighters escorting bombers toward Allied positions. 8 freshly modified Corsairs thundered down the strip and climbed hard into the humid blue. Normally, this meant long chases, frantic bursts, and pilots praying their last rounds counted. But at 300 feet, everything changed. Lieutenant Hansen dove first. He waited, closer, closer, until the bomber nearly filled his sight. A 2-second burst ripped through an engine, snapping the wing off like driftwood. Flames poured across the ocean. Around him, Zero fighters tried to dodge the concentrated beam of fire, but the tighter pattern bit too fast. 1-second taps tore cockpits apart. Wings separated mid-turn. In minutes, the formation unraveled. Back at base, gun camera footage stunned briefing tents. Instead of wide halos of tracers drifting harmlessly around targets, every burst now looked like a poured stream. Thick, focused, brutal. For the first time in months, pilots returned not with empty belts, but with ammunition to spare. Their voices over the radio sounded different. Calm, almost relaxed. The fear was gone. Word spread beyond the island. Soon, nearby squadrons requested the same adjustment. Japanese radio intercepts even changed tone, warning pilots to avoid close engagements with Corsairs, calling their fire instant death. The enemy's confidence cracked. Suddenly, American fighters held the sky like clenched fists. When engineering officers finally inspected the reinforced mounts, the results shocked them. Instead of failing, the added braces actually reduced stress. Manuals were quietly updated. Headquarters took credit. McCarthy's name stayed buried in paperwork. But pilots knew. They toasted him in tents lit by lanterns, telling new arrivals, "If you're still breathing, thank the man with the wrench." What had started as an unauthorized gamble reshaped the air war. In the Pacific, survival didn't come from obeying every line in the manual. It came from someone willing to tighten 4 bolts and change everything. When the war ended, no spotlight found Staff Sergeant Mickey McCarthy. He went home, fixed cars, and raised a family. His service record never mentioned the modification that saved lives, and headquarters never admitted a mechanic solved what engineers wouldn't. But the pilots remembered. In memoirs and letters, they wrote that concentrated fire turned desperation into dominance, and they credited one man for it. Modern fighter cannons still follow his principle. Aim where real combat happens, not where charts say it should. McCarthy died quietly, without medals or headlines, but every pilot who survived because of that 300-foot convergence carried his legacy into the future. Heroism doesn't always sit in the cockpit. Sometimes it stands in a hangar at midnight, tightening bolts no one else believed in.